those of you coming in, welcome, welcome. All right, so it is officially 11 a.m. Eastern, so we are going to get started. My name is Dr. Brianna Beaupre. You can call me Bree. I am an assistant professor at Wichita State and also a board member for CrimCon. And this is our very first virtual conference, so we're super excited to have you all here. We've had over 300 presentation submissions, so it's been an amazing turnout. Some of our panels have had over 60 attendees, which we've joked, is more than our typical ASC panels. So this has been really exciting and great. So thank you all for coming, both as panelists and attendees. So I'll go over a few things for you to know as attendees. We're going in the order of the conference program. Each panelist will have 10 minutes to present. And please post your questions in the Q&A box and they will answer it at the end. I will read your questions verbally to the panelists and they will answer. And so this is what it looks like if you're an attendee. So you'll want to post your questions here in the Q&A. And just remember to have fun. We started CrimCon to be something, different and fun and inclusive. And so we're really excited to have you all here. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and start the panel, which is entitled Domestic Violence Policy. And we'll have our first panelist begin.
I'm not sure if the screen's popping up on everyone's screen. Okay.
Yeah, it looks great. Yep.
Hi, everyone. My name is Vincent Yang. I'm a doctoral student at Michigan State. I'm presenting today on a survey project about recommended actions in the domestic violence scenario with Dr. Christina DeJong here. The purpose of this study is to determine recommended victim actions in a hypothetical domestic violence scenario about and how those recommendations may vary by race of the couple and race of the respondent. This hypothetical scenario that we developed is shown here. Includes some like verbal abuse and physical abuse, and we ask what do the participants think the female character or the victim should do. We used popular baby names from 2019 as race-based names or ethnic names used in this scenario. For example, we use Johnny and Christine for white couple scenario, Alejandro and Valentina for Latinx scenario. And for our theoretical framework, we used critical race theory. It suggests that race is a normal aspect of society and white people benefit from racism and thus have little reason to eradicate it, and that race is socially constructed and it's used to vilify different groups according to social needs. We hypothesized based on the critical race theory that first, support for IPV myths will include the chance of people recommending informal actions or decrease their chance of recommending formal actions. Respondent race and victim race are also going to matter. That white respondents are more likely to recommend formal actions than other races, and respondents are more likely to recommend formal actions when victims are Black, Latina, or Middle Eastern. I'm switching to Dr. DeJong for the statistics part.
Thanks, Vincent. So just a quick overview here of our demographics. As you can see, most respondents were female, which is not surprising. We used a convenient sample of students at several universities, and given the topic of the survey, domestic violence, leads us to believe that more women would be amenable to answering than men. Most of the respondents were white, which is not surprising. Given the recommended action, the most common response for what the victim should do is call police, with 40% of respondents recommending that action as compared to calling social services or calling friends and family. 35%. And as you can see, because we did randomize the race of the couple in the scenarios, that's very evenly distributed across surveys. So we had approximately 20% in each of those racial groups. The next thing we looked at were the bivariate findings, and we found that there wasn't a lot of significant relationships here except for the race of the couple. And again, this was given randomly to different respondents. It turns out at the bivariate level that respondents were most likely to recommend that the police be called if the couple was Middle Eastern. So you can see in 72% of those scenarios, our respondents said call the police, compared to the white scenarios in which they only said call the police in 45%, 45.8. And you can see how across those racial groups, we ordered them by percentages. So you can see that Black, Latinx, and Middle Eastern couples had a higher rate of people recommending formal action. So recommending the police be called, as opposed here to white and Asian respondents. I'm sorry, the white and Asian couples. Race of respondent didn't have a significant impact at the bivariate level. The one thing that we are seeing here, but again, not significant, is that Latinx respondents were more likely to say call police. But that again wasn't significant. With regard to calling friends and family, we included this because in some Asian cultures, calling the police is frowned upon because they view domestic violence as more of a family issue. So it would warrant a less formal response in some Asian cultures. And we don't really see that. We see it a little bit with Asian respondents. They're slightly more likely to say call friends and family than call police. But our next step was to look at these issues controlling for other variables. So we have 4 models here. The first 2 look at the call police model. The second 2, model 3 and 4, look at call friends and family. One of our hypotheses was not supported, that support for domestic violence myths would lead to a more formal response on the part of the victim, and we didn't find that had any relationship at all. The only things that were significant were, again, that Middle Eastern couple. That respondents who got the Middle Eastern couple were much more likely to say that a formal police action was warranted compared to the white couple in the scenarios. Respondent race was significant in model 1 for calling the police. That other group, unfortunately, we had a very small number of respondents in some racial groups and had to combine them. So we need to pull that out and see what exactly is happening there. Model 2 and model 4 look a little bit different, because we included a variable that asked, does the race of the respondent match the race of the couple? Just to see if there were some intra-racial findings there. And we didn't find anything significant there. And I think at this point, I'll hand it back to Vincent.
Okay. So as Dr. DeJong said, there are very few significant findings. For one thing, support for IPV myths and respondent race. So that is hypothesis 1 and 2 are not supported. Hypothesis 3, the couple race matters, is only partially supported in this study. There are, of course, a lot of limitations to this study, such as that we did not include a measure for racism or racial intolerance that could be helpful when using critical race theory. We also would like to include recommended actions against offenders, and we would like to have a more diverse sample if needed that includes like SES, other backgrounds, gender identities, and the pros and cons of using a college sample, of course. Thank you.
Great, excellent job. So next, panelist number 2.
Second. Okay, can anyone see that?
Yeah, that looks great.
Okay, go ahead, Chelsea.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chelsea Ocon, and I'm a field advisor with the National Network for Safe Communities. Towards the end of this brief segment, I'll be joined by my colleague, Alex Acevedo. And I'm certain that I speak for us both when I say we're truly glad you've made it a point to join us here today, especially with all of the other incredible presentations occurring this morning. So Alex and I are here to speak with you about IPVI and share some promising preliminary findings from one of our sites that's implementing the strategy. And when I say IPVI, I'm talking about the Intimate Partner Violence Intervention. So to get started, I'm going to give you guys a little crash course on the NNSC and what it is we do. So essentially, we aren't your typical research center. We aim to drive change on the ground in real time, and we do this through intensive hands-on advising, which means working directly with all levels of frontline practitioners to unpack the problem on the ground, and together working with them to map our evidence-based strategies on in a way that works for the jurisdiction, their resources and capacity in order to address local dynamics at play. As we're here to talk about IPV, we can't do that without acknowledging key challenges in addressing this type of violence. This is an incredibly persistent and pervasive problem. Despite being grossly underreported, IPV comprises 15% of all reported violent crime in the US and approximately 55% of the femicide that occurs here. And despite our best intentions, the traditional responses to IPV have not been nearly as effective as we might have hoped. When we talk about the undue burden placed on victims by our traditional responses to DV, we're talking about the expectation that the victim should leave the relationship, that the victim should get a restraining order, and that the victim should take affirmative criminal legal steps that could put them and their families at further risk upon the offender's release, essentially placing the burden of a solution squarely on their already overburdened shoulders. Additionally, our criminal legal system has consistently failed to hold the vast majority of those who commit acts of IPV accountable in a meaningful way, essentially teaching offenders that they'll get away with it, which is a little something we here at the NNSC call the experiential effect. We have consistently taken a one-size-fits-all approach to IPV, from our criminal legal responses to how we approach intervention programming, which has proven to be woefully ineffective time and time again. And something that's perpetuated this false virtue of a one-size-fits-all approach is that we've been historically wrong about abusive partners. For a long time, we in the field of IPV prevention believed that these individuals were specialists, that they only commit acts of intimate partner violence. They're the doctor, the lawyer, the school principal, the upstanding member of society that goes home and beats their partner behind closed doors. Research has since shown that this is not the case, and that serious and chronic IPV offenders, just like other populations of violent offenders, are overwhelmingly generalists in that they engage in other types of criminal behavior. So in short, the thing is, we know who these people are. We know who they are and what they're doing. The vast majority of the most dangerous abusers within our communities are already known to law enforcement, and it's our responsibility, the state's responsibility, the system's responsibility to make them stop. And it was this very concept that led to the development of IPVI. So you might be asking, how does IPVI work? Well, the success of IPVI hinges upon the establishment of a multidisciplinary partnership comprised of law enforcement at the state, local, federal level, victim advocates, social service providers, and community members. This partnership is key. It's through this partnership, standing and acting together with an explicit commitment to enhancing procedural justice, that direct, consistent, and sustained engagement occurs with both IPV offenders and victims. And it's through that engagement that sustainable reductions in recidivism occur. As we have established already, one size does not fit all, which is why the IPVI framework provides a mechanism for jurisdictions to classify offenders into specific tiers based on their demonstrated offending severity. And it's through this tier system that jurisdictions can assess the risk the abusive individual poses and respond accordingly. Also, keep in mind that the criteria laid out on this slide is not prescriptive. It's simply the general framework, and the specifics of the criteria for each level are tailored to the unique offending dynamic of the jurisdiction in which it's implemented and the facts that present themselves on the ground there. So once an offender is identified and classified, they are met with a specific response by the partnership based on that classification level. And for each offender interaction, there's a corresponding victim response in order to ensure safety and transparency. This parallel response structure provides a method for law enforcement, community, and service providers to communicate directly with abusive partners and victims. That's one of the key aspects of IPVI. In this direct communication with abusive partners and victims, they're able to reduce misinformation while simultaneously removing that shield of anonymity that so many abusive partners hide behind. And we achieve this through the delivery of parallel notifications. And so victim notifications allow victim survivors to make informed decisions about whether or not they wish to seek services or engage in the criminal legal process by letting them know what services are available to them, offering support in terms of developing a safety plan or any other resources they might need, while also advising them of all contacts with the abusive partner and informing them that the burden to stop the violence is on the partnership and not them. While offender notifications provide a clear message of legal consequences for continued offending, emphasizing that any criminal legal action that occurs as a result of their offending is coming from the partnership and not the victim. And it also provides a genuine offer of help, of support, and assistance to those who wish to change their violent behavior. Now, in the event of reoffense, it is absolutely critical that the partnership follows through on the promises made in that notification by holding that abusive partner accountable. Swift follow-through demonstrates that IPV offending will not be tolerated, and it counters the idea that they'll be able to get away with it, which was that experiential effect I was referencing earlier. The goal of notifications in general, both to abusive partners and to victims, is to provide clear prior explanation of how law enforcement will operate and ultimately replace enforcement as much as possible with communication and transparency. The simple act of putting an offender on notice through a notification can deter them from committing a subsequent offense, especially in the case of lower level offenders. And so, in sum, when done well, notifications build trust, thus inherently enhancing legitimacy. Creating certainty in a system that has historically been largely uncertain in and of itself is an act of procedural justice, especially when victims have historically paid the price for that uncertainty. And as we know, legitimacy is all about keeping promises. And when you build that trust by keeping those promises and following through, you get results. And so now I've been talking enough. I'm going to turn it over to Alex, who's going to walk us through those preliminary results we referenced at the beginning of the presentation. Thank you, Alex.
Great. Thank you, Chelsea.
Just a heads up, you have 1 minute.
No problem.
Okay, thanks.
So just a little bit about Kingston. It's located about 90 miles north of New York City, with a population of about 23,000. Prior to full implementation, the National Network for Safe Communities analyzed several IPV incidents to identify serious offenders. Full implementation began in March of 2018, with new IPV offenders receiving notifications on a rolling basis. The preliminary findings developed thus far have been promising based on the occurrence of a second notification after the first initial notification. The overall recidivism rate has been over the 2-year implementation period has been 23%. While victim engagement has remained steady, there has been a 38% reduction in the number of DIRs filed when compared to periods before and after notifications. Partners involved in the intervention have also revealed increased interagency communication and collaboration, something that is central to the functioning of any successful program. So last slide. While these preliminary findings are important, we understand that further research is necessary. To accomplish this goal, we are proposing a study that can be split into 2 sections. The first is to shed light on IPV offending dynamics in Kingston. These include, pervasiveness, concentration of IPV in the city, as well as demographic characteristics of those involved and the overlap between IPV and DV. The second part of our research will be to assess the impact of the intervention, not only on recidivism, but also on IPV-related victim injuries and other important variables based on the literature. This process will involve what we believe to be a quasi-experiment utilizing pre- and post-test measures. And finally, we want to assess the impact of COVID-19 on Kingston and their intervention, as we have seen its impact on DV and IPV around the country. So thank you for your time, and that is all from us.
Great, thank you. Next, we have Ruth.
Okay, good morning here. Before I get started, I do want to take a minute and acknowledge the hard work of the research assistants, both graduate and undergraduate, who made the data collection possible, as well as the State of Delaware Family Court, the Delaware Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and especially all of the survivors who took the time to share their stories with us as part of this process. And so we're going to be talking about civil protection orders here, which are very individualized orders issued through the civil legal system. Now, the effectiveness of civil protection orders for survivors of intimate partner abuse, there's multiple ways to think about effectiveness. And certainly one way is to think about how useful these orders are for survivors. And another way to understand effectiveness is to think about the extent to which these orders, when they are issued, are violated by perpetrators. And so we have a lot of research that exists on the extent to which orders are violated, the extent to which those violations are or are not reported, and some of the factors affecting how it is that the legal system enforces these orders. And we know that violations are underreported, and we know that enforcement is inconsistent. So it's really important to examine why it is that violations are not reported, especially since we're talking about a population by definition of survivors who have engaged with the legal system in order to get the order in the first place. And so this presentation examines those survivors' decision-making processes as they decide whether or as they decide not to report violations. And so this is part of a larger longitudinal mixed methods study that focused on the experiences of women seeking protection orders against male partners or ex-partners. And we conducted highly structured quantitative interviews, as well as a set of more open-ended qualitative interviews with survivors seeking protection orders. These interviews were conducted either shortly after a court hearing and again about 3 months later. And we did have a 75% retention rate across those 3 months. In terms of the sample itself, the majority of participants were either white or Black or African American, with smaller numbers of Latina or multiracial survivors. The average age was about 35, which is a little bit older than some of the related studies, which tend to use a shelter population. Those populations tend to be skew slightly younger. We had a really wide range of income, but the mean was about $28,000, $29,000 a year. And the majority of our participants did have a child under the age of 18. Now, what we found is that most of the participants did receive a protection order. At time one, the vast majority said they intended to report an order violation should it be violated. Only just under half reported that the order was violated. And of those who said it was violated, about a third ended up reporting a violation either to the police or back to the family court system. And these findings are pretty consistent with other research regarding the extent to which orders are violated. But we were really interested in this discrepancy between women who intended to report should something actually happen, and then the drop off in people who actually reported. And so drawing on, particularly on the qualitative interviews that we conducted, one of the reasons survivors gave was that the violations weren't serious enough to report. They didn't think it was serious enough. So one survivor told us that she didn't report the violation because her abuser wasn't physically abusive during the violation or when they had contact. We had another survivor explain that the order allowed for the assailant to text message her about the children and about financial support, but then he continually texted her about things that were actually prohibited in the order. But she said that he hadn't pushed her enough to report these additional messages and that he usually stopped when she asked him to. A second reason that survivors gave for not reporting was a real lack of faith in the legal system itself. So one of our survivors who actually did report a violation lost faith in the legal system because they didn't do anything when she reported. She stated that they kept telling her to come back to court if he violates the order. But when she actually did follow through, they didn't impose any consequences for him. Why'd you tell me to come back to the court right away if he violated it if you're not going to do anything? A third reason that survivors didn't report violations was that the information about reporting communicated during the court wasn't sufficient. So a lot of women simply didn't know how to report a violation. One woman, for instance, told us that she didn't remember what the judge had told her in court because it was a really stressful time for her and she was already overwhelmed as part of the process. And an additional structural barrier that survivors were experiencing was lack of timely service of the order in the first place. So a few women asserted that their abusers had contacted them after the protection order was issued, but because their abusers hadn't appeared in court when the order was issued, they had not yet been served. So the contact wasn't legally considered a violation because the order hadn't been officially served, even though there had been the court process to issue it. And ultimately, this lack of timely service of the order ends up being a threat to these survivors' safety and to their options for safety seeking. So all of these reasons really speak to both the perceived effectiveness of the order, but to the legitimacy of protection orders as an option more broadly. And these reasons really focused heavily on the ways the system needs to be improved rather than just individual survivor decision making. That the legal system really needs to continue to move toward more victim-centered, trauma-informed responses by providing clear guidelines and information both to survivors and especially to perpetrators about what constitutes a violation. Both law enforcement and the courts need to take victims' concerns and safety more seriously, as well as taking these reports of violations seriously. And certainly there are gaps in the service of the orders and in ways of effectively communicating in a trauma-informed way with survivors. And so in sum, there are really complex reasons why women who have used the system previously do not continue to engage with the civil legal system. And all of these reasons that survivors shared have implications for the effectiveness of the order and again, for the legitimacy of the system. And so on some level, while we do know quite a bit about survivors' needs, about survivor decision-making, it's still really important to understand more about their decisions in order to create more just responses to intimate partner abuse and ultimately to improve survivor safety. So, thank you.
Great, thank you. And now, last but not least, we'll turn it over to our final panelist.
Hello, everyone. Just going to get my screen shared.
I like your virtual background.
Thank you. I've had to do it as I've been teaching.
Oh, yeah.
Let's see. Oh, I don't know why this is doing what it's doing.
I know it's been doing that today.
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Kayla Toohy. I'm a third-year doctoral student at the University of Central Florida, and I'm in the Department of Sociology along with Dr. Amy Rechtenwald and Sierra Peebles. And today I'll be presenting on the impact of services and access to services on female victim intimate partner homicide at the county level in Florida. So briefly, I'd like to go over a little bit of literature that has been collected for the current project, and then I want to spend the majority of my time on our methodology and our results. Intimate partner homicide is the most extreme form of intimate partner violence that can occur within an intimate relationship. And a study published in 2013 reported that intimate partner homicide occurred in 1 out of every 7 homicides worldwide. In over half of the homicides involving women, they were committed by an intimate partner from 2003 to 2014 in a study of 18 states. Additionally, a study published in 2018 found that 51.4% of female victims were killed by a former or current intimate partner, compared to only 8% of male victims. As we continue to explore this research, we began to orient ourselves over the access that intimate partner violence victims have to help-seeking services. And we've noted that through the late 1990s, statistics showed that approximately 3% to 8.9% of women were able to access some form of shelter service. In the early 2000s, roughly 4% of a sample of murdered female victim intimate partners was able to access a shelter service in the year prior to being murdered by their intimate partner. And more recently in 2014, it was shown that only 4 out of 10 intimate partner violence victims sought support, and only 6% of that sample were able to use formal services, which were the police or some other form of shelter service. Additionally, as we looked throughout this literature, we showed that findings had noted that in rural locales, intimate partner violence victims may have worse health outcomes than those that were located in urban settings. And all of these statistics indicate a severe lack of usage where domestic violence services and shelters are concerned. As we narrowed in on our focus, we started to explore the role that location played in the access that intimate partner violence victims had to these different help-seeking services. It has been well documented in literature, and overall, rates of intimate partner homicide in rural areas have been found to be higher than that of urban areas. We noted the factor of social isolation and the role that it played in these different types of intimate partner violent relationships. And social isolation is defined as a lack of social interaction or integration of a community members to outside individuals. This confined spatial location has been shown to lead to social isolation for intimate partner violence victims. And this social isolation has been identified as a risk factor for abused women in a number of studies. The two research questions that we attempted to answer were: one, are higher rates of female victim intimate partner homicides found in counties with the least access to help-seeking services? And two, do counties with access to safe methods of transportation have lower rates of female victim intimate partner homicide? Our dependent variable was the female victim intimate partner homicide rate by county, which was offset by the population at risk 15 and over and logged for normalcy or normalized distribution. Our intimate partner homicide rate was gathered from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement supplemental homicide reports between the years of 2005 and 2015. We included 3 categories of independent variables, including transportation variables, shelter resources, and coordinated community response. Our transportation variables aimed to assess what options individuals had to locate and get to various resources that were available in county. Our shelter resources encapsulated the types of resources that shelters or other accredited services offered in county. And our coordinated community response measure is a novel measure that seeks to recognize specialized law enforcement departments and task forces that are present in order to reduce the instance of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. Additionally, we had 3 control variables, which included the proportion of the population living in rural areas by county, a racial and ethnic heterogeneity index that was first introduced by Blau, and a disadvantage index that was comprised of 5 measures. Our analytic strategy was a negative binomial regression, which was broken down into a 4-part model to highlight the significant relationships that may occur with the addition of key variables. We chose to use a negative binomial regression because of overdispersion present in our data, and because our model was based on a rate variable that was derived from the female victim intimate partner homicide count in each of the 67 Florida counties. Our first table shows our descriptive statistics of all of our variables and gives us a good overview of the distribution of various resources throughout the state, beginning with the female victim intimate partner homicide rate, which was 1.31 on average for all 67 counties between the 10-year period. We can additionally note that about 45% of counties had some form of a coordinated community response. 61% of counties had a shelter or safe house in the county boundaries. 24% had a transitional housing option. 52% had some form of a Spanish-speaking service. 69% had some form of a rape or sexual assault service present. And regarding our transportation variables, roughly 1 car per person over 16 and over was registered in the 67 Florida counties. 87% of counties had shelter transportation assistance, and 61% had their shelter accessible by public transportation. Additionally, for our control variables, disadvantage was z-scored to rescale our mean to 0 and the standard deviation to 1 in order for additional ease in interpreting the results of our regression analysis. Our range of -2.25 to 2.31 tells us that counties range between extremely low disadvantage, which is considered to be anything 2 standard deviations below the mean, and extremely high disadvantage, which is considered to be anything 2 standard deviations above the mean. Additionally, we included a racial and ethnic heterogeneity measured, which showed that for all counties, we fall at 0.43 on a 0 to 1 range, with 0 being the least heterogeneous and 1 being the most heterogeneous in a county. Finally, the proportion of the population living in rural areas by county shows that about 38% of the population in Florida resides in a rural area. Our second table shows our negative binomial regression model results, which are broken down into 4 parts, but today I'm going to specifically focus on our full model, Model 4. In the full Model 4, 4 statistically significant variables are identified. 2 of our measures of domestic violence services are significantly associated with female victim intimate partner homicide. As expected, the results indicate that the presence of a shelter or safe house within the county decreases the expected mean rate of female victim intimate partner homicide by a factor of about 0.45. As displayed in the main effects model, the presence of a rape or sexual assault counseling and services within a county is associated with an increase in the expected mean rate of female victim intimate partner homicide by a factor of 1.98. Unfortunately, none of our transportation measures showed up as statistically significant in our model. But we did have 2 control variables that had significant associations with female victim intimate partner homicide. It appears that for every 1 unit increase in the disadvantage index, the expected mean rate of female victim intimate partner homicide increases by about 53%. Furthermore, a 1 unit increase in the proportion of the population living in rural areas is associated with an increase by a factor of 6.75 in the expected mean rate of female victim intimate partner homicide. There were a few limitations inherent to our study. Because we only used 1 state, we only had 67 counties under analysis, so we are unable to generalize our results outside of the state of Florida. Additionally, our shelter measures do not directly measure access, but rather presence. And our transportation measures, while not fully encompassing of all options, have shown some promise, hopefully in the future, but we do recognize some people may not have a car or may own multiple cars as well. And finally, for our measure of rurality, our data makes it impossible to analyze the differences that occur between rural and urban counties in accordance with previously conducted research. Future directions of our research include adding additional measures to better assess access to help-seeking services, and including a larger sample size of states and analysis at a smaller level of aggregation. Thank you for your time. I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Awesome, thank you. So now I'm going to open it up for Q&A. So I'll read these questions out loud for the panelists. If you could stop sharing your screen.
Oh, sorry. I don't know.
You're good, no worries. Awesome. So the first question is to Alexis and his partner. Do you think this intervention could be implemented in a larger city?
Yes. We work with cities of all sizes. And ultimately, that's one of the major benefits of this being a framework, in the sense that it's about analyzing and understanding the dynamics and facts on the ground and tailoring the strategy appropriately to meet those needs, taking into account the jurisdiction's capacity, resources, etc. And currently, we're working with 2 larger scale metropolitan cities in the US to implement this strategy. And one of the things that we do when we work with larger cities is that we move very, very methodologically and slowly, ultimately, just to kind of ensure intervention efficacy, ensure that all of the risks and potential obstacles that could come up when it comes to victim safety are being addressed appropriately before we even start. That way we can ensure victim safety, and we can also build the confidence of the partners while implementing. So normally we start slow with the higher level offenders, and then we slowly work towards implementing those other tiers and those other levels.
Awesome, thank you. And again, to Alex and Chelsea, has anyone looked at the routine activity theory that can explain or help notice other open opportunities IPV engage in, along with the tiers that was explained to actually identify the risk factors of IPV?
That's a great question. I think our framework doesn't explicitly use routine activities, but I think implicitly, I think we do borrow from some of those ideas. I think IPV, um, looking at specific incidents in IPV, I think those are very amenable to routine activities. And I think ultimately what our intervention hopes to do is to, remove the motivations for offending, and also make both the system and the community a more capable guardian. So I definitely think it's a great question, and internally I think we'll do some brainstorming to see how we can incorporate those ideas that line up well with the intervention. So thank you for the question.
Great. Next question is from Frank. Ruth, I missed the geographic area from which you drew your participants. With regard to service in that state, is there a requirement for law enforcement to serve orders? I worked in New Jersey where orders were turned over to local law enforcement or sheriffs for service as soon as possible.
So we drew Newcastle County, Delaware. I was struck by the folks from Florida talking about your 67 counties. We got 3 counties. We're this big. And so we drew it from northern Delaware, basically. I'm not actually sure there's a statutory requirement for law enforcement. Part of the way the process is currently set up, the expectation is that both the complainant and the respondent will be in court as these decisions are being made. So there is no need to deal with service, right? If the respondent's already there, they know it's issued, the end. It is very common for law enforcement to do this service. I think part of the issue is what counts as soon as possible really ends up varying law enforcement to law enforcement, situation to situation, how hard it is for law enforcement to find the respondent and so forth. But that's a whole other set of procedural questions that really need to be addressed. And it speaks to in some ways, the lack of coordination across systems and between the police and the courts and the civil branches and the criminal branches here.
Great, thank you. Another one for Ruth. Can Section 1983 be filed by the women who seek protection by the court order allows risks, as you mentioned, and such as deprivation of rights granted to them under the Due Process and Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, the injuries? I ask this because of the implications that were stated in your recommendations if they want the courts to take the violation seriously.
Okay, and I admit I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not familiar with Section 1983. I think part of what's going on here is that these civil protection orders are through the civil system. It's a civil order with potential criminal penalties, rather than a criminal finding. And so it's very common both under Delaware law and across the country for there to be very individualized responses where on the one hand, there is an order to not have contact and they are expected to co-parent. And so there end up being exceptions carved out in the protection order for contact about the children or other ways of on the one hand, continuing contact. But part of this, I think, in terms of things like equal protection under the law, I think there's some complexity there with the civil law as an issue to the extent to which the 14th Amendment applies mostly to criminal acts. But again, I'm not a constitutional scholar or a lawyer. So if anyone else would like to jump in, that would be awesome too.
Okay, so we just have a minute left. So I'll ask the last question to Alex and Chelsea. Why do you think it is so hard to get buy-in to try new strategies like IPVI?
So I think one big thing is money, if we're being honest here. I think that when there isn't necessarily a lot of funding available, and I think that although IPVI is very promising in the sense that most interventions, strategies for IPV intervention and prevention, the recidivism rate for individuals who have caused harm tends to fall between 40 and 60%. And our strategy has consistently shown recidivism rates of below 25% in the jurisdictions that we have implemented in. One of our jurisdictions where it was piloted, High Point, North Carolina, has had a steady recidivism rate of below 20% for the last 10 plus years. And we're seeing these preliminary positive indicators now. So even though it's promising, I think that people are a little reluctant to put money behind something that is so new. But at the same time, throwing your money behind our traditional approaches, which have been proven to not be as effective, also doesn't seem to make sense either. So I think a lot of it is money, but I don't think that there's a lack of will or hope amongst jurisdictions and partners. I think a lot of people want to be able to do innovative strategies like this. And I just think that they have a hard time securing the means to be able to make that happen.
Excellent. Well, with that, we are going to wrap up this session. I'd like to thank the panelists very much for presenting their work related to domestic violence, intimate partner violence. For the next session, if you'd like to attend, I'm going to reset this webinar. So you'll just have to sign back in through the link on CrimCon. And thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.